Okay, so generally we're going to start with the different parts of skeleton, going to go through it, but I want to highlight something. Look, the first sort of push is to start with the head. When you're going to be studying, you think, oh, I'm going to start with the head, then I'm going to go down the thoracic cage, then I'm going to do the upper limbs, then I'm going to do the lower limbs. Which means when you get to lower limbs, you're tired and you can't remember anything. What I usually say, pick one part and study it. Then go completely random, like I'm going to study leg, then I'm going to study vertebral column, then I'm going to be studying arm, and then the cranium. Does that make sense? And next time, change the sequence. So you dedicate the same amount of time to each part. Okay? Let's start with the cranium. Okay? Some of the bones are very, very simple. So this is frontal. These two bones are parietal bones. This one is the occipital bone. The frontal and two parietal bones are separated by a suture, which is called a coronal suture. Parietal bones right here are separated by the sagittal suture. If you look in the back of the skull, the occipital bone is separated from two parietal bones by the lambdoid suture. It looks like a Greek letter lambda. And two more paired bones that form the cranium here. This is the temporal bone. There is right and left temporal bone, which is separated from the parietal bone by another suture right here, which is called a squamous suture. It can be seen on the different side. Okay? A squamous suture. Few bone features that I want you to know. First of all, some bone features on the occipital bone. If you put the skull like this large opening is the foramen magnum. This is where your spinal cord basically / brainstem gets in there. That makes sense? Next to foramen magnum, look, there's two projections, small projections. Okay, those are called occipital condyles. The importance of occipital condyles, can you touch them, feel them, right? Occipital condyles form a gliding joint, basically, with the first cervical vertebrae. Okay, when these occipital condyles move relatively to the first cervical vertebrae, you are able to say yes. Okay, we're good? Few more features on the temporal bone. These two projections, these two processes, are called, the blunt one is called a mastoid process, and the sharp one is called a styloid process. Can you see this too? Mastoid and styloid. Mastoid process is the origin, is the insertion for sternocleidomastoid muscle that rotates your head. And styloid process here is the origin for a whole bunch of deep muscles in the neck that are responsible for swallowing, speech, and so on and so forth. So far we good? Now these bones form a big part of the calvaria, the part that covers your brain. Now if you open this part and look inside, you will see three shallow depressions anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossae. If you will take a brain, it will fit right in. Like this. It basically repeats the shape of the brain. Okay? Now, if you look really, really close at the medial cranial fossa, you may notice that the fossa itself is shaped kind of like a butterfly. The main part of that fossa is the butterfly-shaped bone, which is positioned like this in the cranium. Sorry. Like this. This bat or butterfly-shaped bone is called a sphenoid bone. It is deep in the cranium, like you cannot easily separate it on the model. Does that make sense? It's a keystone bone. So it basically, keystone bone means that it articulates with all other bones in the cranium. So far we good? Now, last bone that makes up the cranial cavity is the ethmoid bone. It's pretty neatly shaped bone, okay? So if you want to look at the position of that bone in the skull, think of it this way. So here, you can see a little projection in the anterior cranial fossa, which is called crista galli. This, on the ethmoid bone, is crista galli. So the bone is located in the, like in my cranium, it will be positioned something like this. That makes sense? Ethmoid bone, you have heard about it from our conversation about the olfactory system. The roof of your nose, nasal cavity, is right here, okay? And this little part in the center, this one, this is called perpendicular plate, and it forms part of your nasal septum. Now, to make your life a little easier, do you need to know this overwhelming amount of details about the ethmoid and sphenoid bone? No. At this point, just recognize them. Okay, show you this, you tell me, oh, disarticulated. Show you this, you tell me, well, that's sphenoid. Show you this, you tell me, well, that's ethmoid. Okay? Make sense so far? Now, what about facial bones? Well, they are not really hard. So first of all, you see these cheekbones? Zygomatic bones. Right here. Pictures of the skull are all in the study guide, so you know what to expect. Okay? These bones, any guesses what these bones are called? Nasal. Those are nasal bones. They form the bridge of the nose. Okay? Now, if you look on the side here, you see the bone kind of on the side of the nose with the nasolacrimal duct opening, a little fake hole on the side of the nose. So this is lacrimal bone. Really small, I call it a stupid bone, because it's small and just, little lacrimal bone. Okay, we good so far? So we've got 2 zygomatic, 2 nasal, 2 lacrimal. This bone is maxilla, upper jaw. Okay? 2 bones, 2 individual bones during the fetal development, they fuse. If they don't fuse, what happens? What do we call this condition when maxillary bones don't fuse? Cleft palate. Now, maxilla not only forms the most of your, not only forms your upper jaw, it also forms most of the roof of your oral cavity, what we call a palate, a hard palate. Okay, so the anterior part of the hard palate is formed by maxillary bone, or maxilla. The posterior part, right here, is formed by two fused palatine bones. Okay, we're good so far? Now, before we get to the most obvious bone in the face, if you look down the nasal cavity here, you can see a plow-shaped bone that forms part of the septum in the bottom. It separates the nose basically into two nostrils. You see that? This bone at the bottom is called vomer. It's not paired, just one bone. And again, if you look into the nose, into the nasal cavity, let me grab a pencil, you can see this bone, this kind of a fold within the cavity. This one, it's really hard to operate by looking at the monitor, but this fold, the bottom two paired folds on the walls of the nasal cavity. Can you see them? They're like hand down. This is the inferior nasal conchae. This is the separate bone. It increases this surface area in your nose, allowing it to work basically better. Okay. So far we're good? Most obvious bone. Of course this. The only freely movable bone in the head, which is mandible. Okay? Now, so far, one interesting feature, and you will see that feature all over, every bone, except one, every bone articulates with some other bone. The only exception from the rule, do you see that bone right here? This is the hyoid bone. It's the bone that is deep in the deep in the neck, and basically it is the site of attachment for the muscles that control the voice box, control your speech. This bone does not articulate with any other bone in the body. It doesn't form any joints at all. Cranium, does it make sense?